Welcome to the deep dive. Where we like to take these really complex topics and try to, come out the other end understanding them a bit better. And today we are diving into the murky waters of Idaho House Bill 37, which is throwing a huge curveball into the whole debate about capital punishment in America. We've got legal analyses, we've got excerpts from the bill itself, letters from concerned citizens, even a study guide. So clearly someone out there is trying to wrap their head around all this. Our mission today is to try to answer some key questions like, why did Idaho even go down this road? What kind of legal and ethical challenges are they facing? And what does it all mean for the future of the death penalty in the U.S.?
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that Idaho is making the firing squad their primary method of execution. Not just like a backup like a few other states, but like the go-to. And it's a move that is sparking some pretty heated debate all over the country.
So let's rewind a little bit here. Firing squads, to me that sounds like something out of, like an old Western movie, not something you'd see in a 21st century legal system. So were they ever common in Idaho specifically?
Well, interestingly enough, Idaho does have a history with firing squads. They were actually the preferred method back when it was still a territory, before it even became a state. But like most of the U.S., they shifted to lethal injection in the 20th century because they saw that as a more humane alternative.
Which makes this bill even more surprising, right? And it was like they're going backwards in time when it comes to execution methods. And from what we've been reading, there's this one theory that keeps popping up is problems with lethal injection.
Yeah, you're right on the money. Securing the drugs you need for lethal injection is just getting harder and harder for these states that still have the death penalty. And there have been, some really high-profile botched executions, which has made a lot of people question whether it's actually reliable or not.
So Idaho's solution is to bring back the firing squad. But, our listener might be wondering, is this even constitutional?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it really all boils down to the Eighth Amendment, which says you can't have cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court, they haven't completely outlawed the death penalty, but they've set a pretty high bar for how you can do it.
Yeah, and going through the research here, I've seen some descriptions of the potential suffering you can get from gunshot wounds that are pretty graphic. I can definitely see how that would raise some eyebrows.
Absolutely. And a key case to think about here is Bays v. Reese back in 2008. It basically said that an execution method can't have what they called a substantial or objectively intolerable risk of serious harm. That phrase right there, substantial or objectively intolerable risk, that's really the heart of the issue.
Okay, so break that down for our listener. What does that actually mean, in plain English?
Well, basically, it means that the state can't go out of its way to cause unnecessary pain and suffering. There's always going to be some level of pain when you're talking about executions, but it has to be kept to a minimum. And the court has to look at it and say, okay, is this level of pain justifiable, considering the state's interest in actually, carrying out the punishment?
So is a firing squad, by its nature, more likely to cause that kind of substantial risk of harm? Compared to, lethal injection, for example?
Well, that's where the legal arguments start to get really interesting. The people who are against firing squads, they point to the potential for things to go wrong, like missed shots, prolonged suffering, and it's a pretty grim picture to paint. And their argument is that this basically creates a risk of cruel and unusual punishment that's just not acceptable.
But on the other hand, Idaho might say, you know what, a firing squad is actually more reliable than lethal injection.
Yeah.
Especially when you look at all the problems with getting the drugs and the botched procedures. It's a pretty morbid calculation, but is there something to that?
It's complicated. Even if a firing squad is statistically more reliable, if you just look at the numbers, that doesn't automatically mean it's constitutional. The courts still have to decide if the inherent risks of the method, even if you keep them as low as possible, whether those risks cross the line into cruel and unusual punishment.
This feels like a real legal tightrope walk, and Idaho is right in the middle of it. So we've talked about the Eighth Amendment, but what other legal landmines could HB 37 be stepping on?
You're right. There's also the whole issue of due process.
Okay, so due process, for anyone listening who's not a lawyer, it basically means the government can't just do whatever it wants. There need to be rules, procedures, safeguards to protect people's rights.
Exactly. And one of the core principles of due process is that laws have to be clear, they have to be understandable, people need to know what's expected of them, what they can and can't do.
And looking through all these sources we have, there are a lot of letters from people who are worried that HB 37 just doesn't meet that standard. They feel like it gives too much power to the director of the Idaho Department of Correction.
And, their concerns are coming straight from the way the bill is written, which, to be honest, is a bit of a head-scratcher in some places.
Yeah, I was looking at the actual text myself, and I have to agree, it's surprisingly vague on some pretty key points. Like, for instance, it requires the director to certify that a firing squad is available. But it doesn't even define what available means.
That is a perfect example of the vagueness problem. What does the director even use to decide if something's available? Like, what kind of training do you need? What equipment do you need? The bill doesn't say anything about those really important details.
So one director might be like, oh, we got some rifles on a wall, good to go. But another director might say, no, no, no. We need special training, special facilities, all kinds of things. It seems like you're just asking for inconsistency and maybe even abuse.
Exactly, and that lack of clarity really raises some serious due process concerns. The people who are against this bill, they say this gives the director way too much leeway. They can basically make life or death decisions without clear legal guidelines.
And that potential for abuse is exactly what's freaking out those people who wrote in.
Yeah.
They see this as power shifting away from the courts and towards one person.
Yeah, it's understandable why they'd be worried. The law is vague, and then you combine that with the fact that this is capital punishment. Life and death, it's a situation where injustice could easily happen.
And we haven't even talked about the ethical side of all this yet.
Oh, yeah, we'll get to that. But first, let's dig into another legal principle that's at play here, something called the separation of powers.
Okay, so separation of powers, that's the idea that you divide the power of the government into three branches, right? Legislative, executive, and judicial. And each one has its own role to play. They're supposed to be like checks and balances on each other.
That's it. It's all about making sure no one branch gets too powerful. And some of these legal experts are saying that HB 37 throws that whole balance off.
How so?
Well, by giving the director so much power over how executions are done, this bill could be taking power protecting people's rights and making sure the law is applied fairly. They might not get much of a chance to actually review the director's decisions.
This makes me think of that landmark case we read about, Youngstown Sheet and Tubecumby Sawyer.
Yeah, that case was all about why it's so important to respect the boundaries between the different branches of government. And some legal scholars are drawing some pretty strong parallels between that case and the potential problems with HB 37.
So just to sum it up for our listeners, we're looking at a triple whammy of legal challenges here. Potential Eighth Amendment violations, due process concerns, and questions about the separation of powers.
It's turning into a legal battleground for sure, and nobody knows how it's going to end up.
But even if Idaho jumps through all these legal hoops, there are still some really big ethical questions hanging over all of this.
You're absolutely right. We've only just started to unpack this whole complicated issue.
Feels like Idaho was looking for, I don't know, like a quick fix to this really complicated problem with HB 37. But they might have just opened up this whole can of worms, legally and ethically.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And one thing that really jumped out at me while we were going through all these sources is how this whole debate is playing out in the court of public opinion, too.
Oh, right. It's not just a legal battle. It's like a societal one. What are people in Idaho actually saying about all this? Are they okay with bringing back the firing squad?
Well, it's a mixed bag, which I guess you'd expect with something this controversial. We don't have any polls or anything in the stuff we've got. But the letters from people give you a sense of how different everybody's opinions are. You've got people who are really disturbed by this bill. They see it as like going back to the dark ages. They're worried about executions going wrong, the psychological impact on everyone involved, and just what this says about Idaho's values.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, capital punishment is already such a sensitive topic, and then you add in this method that feels so old-fashioned, it's going to get people riled up.
Totally. But then you've got the people who think the firing squad is actually more straightforward, more honest. They say lethal injection is like trying to pretend we're being humane.
Right.
When we're still taking a life, they see the firing squad as being upfront about it, acknowledging the seriousness of what's happening, even if it's, tougher to look at.
It's interesting hearing both sides. I guess it comes down to what you consider humane when it comes to death penalty, which is like a whole other philosophical debate.
Yeah, it really is. And this whole fight over HB 37 is basically about how the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment applies to this specific method. It's like they're trying to balance the state's right to carry out the death penalty with the need to protect individual rights.
Speaking of the legal side of things, we talked about the Eighth Amendment and due process, but the sources also mentioned this thing called the vagueness doctrine. as a potential problem with HB 37.
Oh, yeah. The vagueness doctrine basically says that laws have to be clear and specific. People need to know what they can and can't do, no guessing games. If a law is too vague, people can challenge it and say it's unconstitutional.
So it's like telling someone, don't be bad. That's not a law. It's just, I don't know, a suggestion.
Exactly. A law needs to be specific enough that regular people can understand it, and that it can be applied fairly to everyone. And like we were talking about before, HB 37 has some language that's pretty open to interpretation.
That whole availability thing is a great example. The bill says the director has to certify that a firing squad is available. But it doesn't say what that even means. It's like giving the director a blank check.
And that's exactly where the vagueness doctrine comes in. People against the bill could say that not being clear violates due process because it gives the director way too much power, and they could make unfair decisions.
It's crazy how all these legal concepts are connected. We've got the Eighth Amendment, due process, the vagueness doctrine. It's like a legal jigsaw puzzle.
It really is. And if you want to add another piece to the puzzle, there are also legal scholars who are worried about the separation of powers, which we were discussing a little while ago.
Right, the idea that the three branches of government are supposed to keep each other in check.
Exactly. And the worry with HB 37 is that it gives the executive branch too much power. The director has a huge amount of control over life and death decisions. And there's not much the courts can do to check that. It raises some big questions about the structure of our government and how we protect individual rights.
So if you were a judge looking at this bill, what parts would you be most concerned about legally?
Well, I'm not a judge, but if I was looking at it from a legal perspective, the fact that they don't define what available means when it comes to the firing squad would be a big red flag. Not having clear rules like that opens the door to people interpreting it however they want and potentially abusing their power. It's a classic example of what the vagueness doctrine is trying to prevent.
It also seems like the sources keep saying that HB 37 doesn't have enough procedural safeguards.
That's another really important point. Due process isn't just about having clear laws. It's also about making sure the process is fair, that people have a right to be heard, to present evidence, to challenge decisions that affect their lives. And when you're talking about capital punishment, where it's literally life or death, those safeguards are super important.
So even if the director was super careful about explaining why they think a firing squad is available, the fact that there's no way to review or appeal that decision could still be a problem.
Absolutely. If there's no clear and open process for challenging the director's decision, it raises some serious concerns about due process. It basically means the director has the final say, and the courts can't really do anything about it.
Like a one-way street with no exits.
Exactly. And not having those safeguards just makes the whole issue of one person having too much power even worse.
It seems like Idaho was so focused on finding a way to actually carry out executions that they forgot about some pretty basic legal principles.
It's definitely possible it happens sometimes. Lawmakers are trying to solve a tough problem, and they end up creating new ones without realizing it.
And it sounds like they created a whole bunch of problems with HB 37.
Well, problems might not even cover it. This bill could lead to a ton of legal challenges, and it could start a nationwide conversation about the future of the death penalty in America.
Okay, so we've unpacked all the legal stuff, but let's not forget about the human side of this. We're talking about real people's lives here.
That's a really good point. It's easy to get caught up in all the legal jargon and abstract ideas. But we can't forget that this is about people, families, entire communities.
We've got these letters from people who are clearly worried. Some of them are scared about what this chill will do to Idaho's reputation. Others are thinking about the prison staff who would actually have to carry out these executions.
Those are valid concerns. Doing an execution by firing squad isn't just a physical thing. It's emotionally and psychologically heavy. It makes you wonder about the trauma it could inflict, not just on the people directly involved, but on society as a whole.
And we can't forget about the families of the victims. For some people, the death penalty might bring closure, but for others, it might just make things worse.
You're right. The emotional impact of capital punishment goes way beyond the person being executed. It affects families, communities, even the justice system. It's like this ripple effect with consequences that are hard to even grasp.
And this is where the ethical side of this whole debate really hits home. Is it ever right to take a life, even if it's punishment for a terrible crime?
That's a question that people have been debating for centuries. Philosophers, theologians, there's no easy answer. Everyone has to decide for themselves what they believe.
So even if Idaho manages to win all the legal battles over HB 37, they're still going to have to face that moral question.
That's right. And what happens with that, just like the legal stuff, is anybody's guess.
This whole deep dive has been quite a journey, but we're not done yet. There's one more thing about HB 37 that we need to look at. Okay, so we've talked about the Eighth Amendment, due process, even the separation of powers. But there's one last piece of this puzzle we need to look at. It seems like Idaho's lawmakers were really focused on this one specific problem, which was, the practical challenges of doing executions with lethal injection.
Yeah, you're right. They were in a tough spot. Getting the drugs was becoming a nightmare. And then you had all those high-profile botched executions. It makes sense that they'd be looking for something more reliable.
But did they really think about the consequences? Like, did they see this huge legal and ethical mess coming?
It's hard to say. Lawmakers often have to make these big decisions without all the information. They're trying to balance different priorities and, predict the future. It's possible they were so focused on fixing the lethal injection problem right now that they didn't see the bigger picture.
And that bigger picture is pretty important. I mean, we've seen how HB 37 raises all these legal questions about whether firing squads are even constitutional, the whole due process thing, the balance of power between the different branches of government.
And those legal challenges are just one part of it. We've also talked about the ethical issues with capital punishment, which, get even more complicated when you're talking about a method that a lot of people see as cruel and outdated.
It's like this bill is making us look in the mirror and ask some tough questions about ourselves. As individuals and as a society, what does it say about us that we're even thinking about bringing back this kind of execution? A method that feels like it belongs in a history book.
Yeah, it really makes you question our ideas about justice, about compassion, about what it even means to be a progressive society. Are we getting better, more humane, or are we going backwards, hanging on to these old ways of doing things that just seem barbaric?
I'm also thinking about the practical side of actually using firing squads. Like, where would these executions happen? Who would do them? What kind of training and support would they need? These are things Idaho's lawmakers are going to have to figure out if this bill actually goes through.
Those are good points. The logistics of a firing squad execution are pretty complicated, and there are a lot of potential problems. Finding people who are qualified and willing to do it, making sure there are rules in place so mistakes don't happen. Dealing with the psychological impact on everyone involved, it's not easy stuff.
And then there's the money, setting up the facilities, training people, fighting all the lawsuits that are probably coming. All of that costs a lot, and a lot of states are struggling financially right now. So is this really how they want to be spending taxpayer money?
That's a question for the people of Idaho to answer, I guess. They have to weigh the pros and cons. Do they want a more reliable execution method? Even if it means spending a lot of money, dealing with legal challenges, and facing some really tough ethical questions.
So what happens next? What's the next chapter in this whole story?
Well, probably more legal battles. The people who are against this bill are ready to fight, and it's pretty much guaranteed that HB 37 is going to end up in court. What the courts decide will determine whether Idaho can actually go ahead with this whole firing squad plan.
And even if it doesn't get settled in court, this debate is going to keep going in the public. There will be more discussions, more protests, more people wrestling with their consciences as individuals and as communities trying to figure out where they stand on this whole mess. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Idaho House Bill 37. We've explored the legal stuff, the ethical stuff, the practical challenges of this really controversial law. It's a story that's still developing, and there are no simple answers. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you the information you need to form your own opinion about this complicated issue. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep diving deep.